You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about the evil blonde. How did a millionaire become a murderer? And how can a wealthy family be murdered and no one know what happened? And what happens when a suspect is one they never thought they would question? How can no remorse be shown when a family was torn apart in seconds? Now, I'm so thankful for Hunt a Killer to be sponsoring us once again. You guys really liked hearing about them last time, and that makes me so incredibly happy. This mystery subscription box is something that I have seriously become obsessed with. I force everyone around me to do it with me. Even my mother, who doesn't really like true crime, is obsessed with finding out who this killer is. My cat obviously likes it. I'll put in a picture here because she can't stay off of the evidence. Now, each month you learn more and more about the fictional killers, and it's what makes it feel so real because you're learning like in real time with a detective. Not everything is thrown at you at once. You have to learn through a time period and really just compile your own evidence and your own timeline to figure out who did this. Now, I find myself fighting for the victims in this game as much as I would a victim in real life, and it's so cool to be researching a different way. It makes me look at things differently, and I just have learned not to see things for just how they appear even more than I already did. So as someone who watches true crime videos, are you one that can guess who the killer is before I've even told you? And if so, do you think you could do it while conducting your own research? Because I definitely have to compile a story to tell you guys. So do you think while you compiled that story, could you have the same outcome? Could you figure it out before you were told? If you want to try it out, Hunt a Killer has kindly offered you guys 20% off your first box once again. So all you have to do is go to huntakiller.com/BrookeMcKenna and use the discount code Brooke for 20% off your first box, and then we can obsess over it together. Again, thank you so much to Hunt a Killer for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2002 in Brazil, and the von Richthoften family lived in Sao Paulo. Now this consisted of a 49-year-old Manfrid, who was an engineer as well as a director of a company that managed highways in the area, and he was married to Mauricea, who was a well-known and well-respected psychiatrist. These two had actually met at university. They hit it off really quickly, and the wonderful thing about them is they really were opposites who attracted. Mauricea was very much the outgoing, bubbly, just the one that everybody in the room looked at, and Manfred kept to himself. He was more shy, but they loved that about each other. Now, they would actually go to Germany for a while after university, but then they would head back to Brazil, and at this point Manfred became the director of the company and Mauricea opened up her own psychiatry practice. And then they began to realize they wanted more than just the two of them. They wanted a family. In 1983, they would have a girl, and 4 years later, a boy. By 2002, their two children, Suzane, who was 19, and Andreas, who was 15, were really becoming themselves. They were, becoming teenagers and realizing who they were, who they wanted to be, and it was a really close-knit family who were very well respected in the community. Now, they were a pretty wealthy family too, with approximately $5 million to their name, but although they had, a big house and nice items, they were pretty discreet. They didn't throw big parties, they didn't show off or flaunt their wealth. They really were hardworking, and they knew that to keep that money they would need to keep working more. The parents worked really hard, and they also expected their children to do the same. They were sending them to these really nice prestigious schools, and they were expected to get really good grades there. The oldest Suzane was already studying law by the time she was 18. She was accepted into a Catholic university, and she was not only studying law, she had also already learned 4 languages, which were Portuguese, German, Spanish, and English. She was known to be a very happy but shy individual, and she didn't let the shyness stop her. She really did try new things. She hung out with lots of people. She often even went to a Brazilian jiu-jitsu class where she was up to earning a brown belt, which is right under under the black, so she was getting pretty good at it too. She was beautiful, but she was also super loving to her friends. She would always buy them little stuffed animals and gifts and use her money, her weekly allowance, on them. Her younger brother Andreas really did super well in school, and he always seemed to do the right thing. He was just an overall good little boy, and his favorite hobby was actually playing with model airplanes, which at first was a hobby that nobody he really knew was interested in. It's kind of a very unique thing to do, and since he spent hours doing so, he was really craving someone to do it with him. And that is when he found a friend who loved it just as much as he did. He was a little bit older. He was 19-year-old Daniel Cavanis, and they seemed to be very close. They really got to know each other, and Daniel taught Andreas so much about model airplanes, about life. I mean, he was a little bit older, so he was like a little mentor to him. And the children had their hobbies, they had their schooling, they had their friends, and they had a family that loved them, and they all had a pretty good relationship with each other. The whole family was doing well, or so it seemed. But on Halloween night, October 31st, Andreas would sneak out of his home, sure not to wake up the parents, and he was actually going to an internet cafe. Now, back then, Wi-Fi was not accepted in every single home. It wasn't that widely known yet, so they had to go to certain cafes where they would have Wi-Fi in a community setting, and they would often play games there. And so Andreas had left at about 10:30. His sister Suzane said that she would take him to this cafe, but he would need to sneak out. He should also put kind of, pillows and blankets underneath his bed sheet so it looked like somebody was laying there in case anybody checked in on him. And so they picked him up at 10:30 and they would drop him off at this internet cafe, and Andreas could play for hours, they said. They had stuff to do, but they would be back to pick him up. And so he played his game for a while, and around 3 a.m. he was picked up by Suzane. And together they would go back to the house, and they thought everything was going to be fine. But that is when they would find the front door wide open. Suzane immediately called the police for what she believed was a possible burglary. The police arrived, they immediately headed inside the home and had the kids stay outside. They were looking around and calling out for her parents. Suzane said she thought that they were home, but maybe they had went out to search for Andreas when they couldn't find him, and she didn't know. So they were walking around, they were calling out for the parents, and they were getting no answer. That is when they made it to their bedroom. And Manfrid and Mauricea were lying deceased in their bed. They had been beaten to death, and towels had been placed over their face. They also had a room that was a mess. There were briefcases cut open, there was money and jewelry everywhere, and of course it seemed like it did point to a burglary. And the alarm system was also found to be disconnected as well. The only thing was, these robbers didn't take everything from the home that they could have. There was lots of jewelry, there was suitcases full of millions of dollars, thousands of dollars at least, in this home, and they didn't take anything. Well, they did take some, but it wasn't enough to really make a difference or make a dent, and they thought this was really strange to have murdered people for money and not even taken all of it, or at least most of it. Now the investigators would begin their investigation and would go back to the house 2 days later to do more looking and just see if they could find anything that would make a difference. And they knew that the children were supposed to be inside, so they rang the doorbell, but they got no answer, and that is when they heard something in the back of the home. And so they went around there, and they found that there was actually a pool party happening. And this was because it was Suzane's birthday, and she had had some people over, and she wasn't really acting like they expected a mourning daughter to act. She was almost happy, innocent, not grieving at all. And the problem with this is that looks can be deceiving, and some people truly don't grieve the same as others. I often talk about that people who have experienced lots of trauma in their lives are not going to seem as distraught as someone who has never had something happen to them before. So there are going to be times when people don't act the same. However, she was acting very, very happy, and they began to be a little suspicious. At least they thought they could watch her, just see what she did next. That is when these officers who had seen Suzane at her house being like this would talk to the other investigators, and one would say that he was at the home the night her parents were found. He had talked to Suzane and Andreas and told them what had happened to their parents. And he said that Suzane really didn't seem like she was surprised or scared. And she would also then ask him if her and her boyfriend could go to a beach vacation while the investigation was happening. And a little later asked if she could sell their car to make money. Now, all eyes were on this 18-year-old girl at this point, wondering if she could have murdered her parents so brutally. They began to look deeper into the family dynamics to see if they could find a motive for Suzane wanting to murder her parents, and that's when they realized that Suzane's boyfriend was Andreas's friend Daniel. You see, Daniel had been coming over to play with Andreas, and Daniel and Suzane were more close in age, and they began to spend more time together, and at this point they became boyfriend and girlfriend, and it was passionate to them. It was real. Although Daniel didn't have much going for him. He didn't have a job, he wasn't going to school, and he did drugs often. He was also still living at home, but Suzane was really okay with all this. She decided she would support him in anything because she loved him, and he would also give drugs to her. The relationship was becoming more and more serious at this point. She was still in high school, and at her graduation, she actually didn't attend because she said she'd rather be with Daniel. She also spent a lot of nights with him, even though her parents said she couldn't, but she would pretend she was going to a friend's home and hang out with him at a hotel instead. Now, one day, her mom called this friend that she was with because they had had an inkling that Daniel was doing a lot of harm to her, was changing her, but they knew that if they pushed her away from him, it would only push them closer together. And so they weren't really demanding anything just yet. However, they just had a feeling that she was lying to them a lot. So her mother called this friend she was supposed to be staying with, and of course this friend said no, she's not here. And so when Suzane got home the next morning, she was interrogated as to where she had been. She confessed it all, and that was the last straw for her parents. They demanded she no longer see this man, this older guy. And Suzane didn't like this idea at all. But she was 18. She could go out on her own. But they didn't expect how unstable this would really make her. Now, Suzane was actually brought in for questioning in her parents' murder on November 9th, as well as her boyfriend Daniel, who was 21 years old, and his brother, 26-year-old Christian. Now, Daniel and Christian were basically a package deal. Whatever happened to one normally had the other right by their side, and everyone in their lower class neighborhood where they lived knew them to be troublemakers. I mean, it was to the point where neighbors would move away because these boys were so bad and their parents didn't do anything to stop them or to even apologize. They did drugs together, and Christian even went to rehab at one point for doing cocaine. Christian was also thought to be a police informant at one point because he was in such a bad situation that he could really get some details on those type of people. But when they would all be interrogated, Christian would actually be the one to crack first. He was the first one to confess to the murders, and he didn't really take much coaxing to get it out. That's when Suzane and Daniel both confessed shortly after. It did take Suzane being told that Andreas would be looked at next if she didn't confess to what she had done, and this actually did make her talk. So Suzane had just confessed to the murder of her own parents. But what exactly had happened that night? Well, you see, that Halloween night, they had a 2-month plan under their belt. And they decided to take Andreas out of the home so he didn't have to hear it or wonder what was happening. And that is when they would go back into the home. And Daniel had made iron bars and filled it with wood, and then they all would take drugs to prepare themselves to go through with this. And Andreas was completely clueless as to what was happening at his own home. At midnight, they opened the garage door and they headed inside. They were prepared with gloves, stockings over their heads so DNA didn't get anywhere. Suzane went in first to disconnect the alarm system, and then she waited downstairs as she signed for her boyfriend and his brother to go up. Daniel would go to the side of Manfrid, Christian to Mauricea, and that is when allegedly Christian began to cry, saying he couldn't do it, that he couldn't go through with an actual murder. And this is when Daniel got angry and began to beat Manfrid without any hesitation, and Christian felt the only thing he could do was beat Mauricea as well. They continued to hit them over and over until they believed that they were dead. However, they began to make a sound. Now, this is what is known as a death rattle, and they are already dead when this happens, but these men did not know that. And so they went and they put towels in Mauricia's mouth to make her stop, but also over their faces. And over Mauricia's head, they actually put a plastic bag and strangled her further. At this point, they decided that just to be sure, they would pour a pitcher of water over their faces with the towels on it to drown them, and it was complete overkill. But Suzane would come into the room at this point after throwing papers around the library and making it look like this robbery, and she had a bag in her hand, and she got the brothers' clothes that were all bloody, and she put them in this bag. She also would slit open the briefcase, take some money, and hand it to Christian for doing so, for helping, and to keep quiet, basically. That's when they took some jewelry to make it look even more like a robbery, and it was the perfect setup, or so they believed. They also placed a gun next to Manfrid before they left. But you see, investigators, the minute they walked into the home, they knew something was off. They played it off because they didn't want anybody around the area to know that they had known that something was up. But they noticed how everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. Like the papers placed were just like methodically placed. It wasn't like they were just dug through and a mess was created. It looked like somebody had placed them there. And they also didn't know why a gun would be left next to one of the murder victims. It just didn't make sense in their eyes. So the three of them continued to tell the story of that night, and after this they knew they needed an alibi, so they went to check into a local hotel. They got the presidential suite and they ordered Coke, and they sat there to make sure it was known that they were at this hotel. They couldn't have done this. However, they dropped Christian off at a local fast food restaurant where he wanted to go. A few hours later, they would pick up Andreas like nothing had happened and bring him home to find his parents deceased. He would be the only child to mourn the loss of the people who brought them into this world. However, at Manfrid and Mauricia's funeral, prior to her being locked up, Suzane would be there in a crop top and a little sweater, crying her eyes out. She was grieving to everybody who would see her, but anyone with a trained eye would see just how dramatic she was being. A little too forced, and she was really making a big scene about how traumatized she was, even though, the day she was told, she didn't even shed a tear. She was crying like her life depended on it, because her freedom did. If she didn't make everyone believe she was innocent, she knew she would be locked up. However, investigators were pretty quickly following Suzane and Daniel, like I told you, but they were also looking into Christian. And at this point, Christian would actually go and buy a motorcycle using all $100 bills that he had. And like I said, didn't have a ton of money, did drugs, lived on a lower side of town with less money. He was not capable of buying a motorcycle on his own, and that is when they decided it was time to bring them all in because something was up. They just didn't know or feared to know exactly what. Now, I've heard that Brazil's legal system is pretty slow, and it seems so because 3 years later they were still in jail awaiting for trial, and that May, Suzane would actually be granted habeas corpus and would be able to go on house arrest till her trial. She would be out of prison. Derogatory names were painted on the front of her house, and rocks were thrown at her as she tried to get back inside, and she would still be living there with Andreas in their family home. But she wouldn't be free for long because investigators would find a revolver inside her teddy bear, and they feared she was going to go after Andreas next. The trial would be June 5th, 2006, with the charge of the equivalent of the first-degree murder charge, and it would once again be delayed by a month and 12 days, but then after that, they finally had the trial. This was huge news to the public. Everybody wanted to be inside to see what would happen to these three individuals, and it was so much so that the place where you could get a seat to go into this courtroom, the site crashed because so many people wanted inside. Suzane immediately began saying that she was not the mastermind, like everybody was saying, that she was actually the victim here, that it was her older boyfriend who had taken her virginity, who was a drug addict, who did it all, and she was just the innocent bystander who couldn't stop him. The public started looking at her as a petite, innocent blonde who wouldn't be able to do this to her own parents. She was rich. Why would she even want to murder them? It didn't make sense. They said Suzane was just under this impression that her boyfriend was, a god. She had such high expectations for him, and she really felt that he knew what he was doing. She was under his spell of sorts, and the public believed all of this because if you look at things from the perspective of stereotypes, she's a pretty rich girl. He is a poor drug addict. Who are they going to think is guilty? And that is the problem with going with stereotypes. That is the problem with the fact that people can be deceptive, and how they appear is not who they are. Not all the time, at least. The brothers were saying they only did it because she wanted them to, and that they wouldn't have if she hadn't been in their life. Now, her motive was brought into question, asking why would Suzane have done this to her parents? Was there a reason, or did she just want them dead? Her lawyer said she didn't have a motive. That was the whole point. She wouldn't have. But it was brought up that it could have been that her parents forced her to separate from her boyfriend. And the fact that they had actually lived together at this home earlier that year for a month while her parents were on vacation. They didn't know about this, and Daniel and Suzane had lived together in this home. Andreas didn't say anything because he liked Daniel, and so they all lived together, and by the time her parents got home and noticed this, they said, he's not living here. You guys are going somewhere else. And Suzane said, well, will you buy us an apartment together? And they told her, no, we're not doing that. They said, if Daniel wants to be worthy of your love, to support you, he needs to actually support you. He needs to get a job, go back to school, something, so he's contributing to the world. And Daniel wasn't going to do this, but Manfrid told Suzane, we're not keeping you here. There is a whole world out there. If you want to do whatever you want to do, go ahead, but we're not going to support you financially if you don't obey our rules. Now, money was something Suzane refused to let go of. It was her identity, and she needed it in a way where she felt she couldn't earn her own way in the world. And so she didn't want to leave her home, but she didn't want to lose Daniel either. So she began seeing him in secret, and she would tell her parents she was staying with them, that she understood them, and that she wasn't going to see him anymore. But of course we know this was a lie, and Suzane was going to Daniel saying that life would be much better if her family was dead, and that not only would she get to be with a boyfriend that she wanted, she would also get the inheritance she was going to earn, which would be a lot of money. It was theorized that one of these or both could have been motive for the murder, not that either of these are an excuse for what she has done. Some of the public did think that she was simply innocent, that these men had somehow encouraged her to let them kill her parents, and she had nothing to do with it. However, a lot of people who had watched a recent interview of her immediately knew that she was a manipulative liar who had planned everything. And that was because they had messed up big time, her and her lawyers. She had gone for an interview, and right before they were going to start filming, she already had her microphone on, and they didn't realize they had already started filming. And her lawyer began to tell her, you need to cry. To get the sympathy of the audience, you need to cry when you're talking about your mother's and father's death. And she said, I can't do that. What kind of person needs instruction to seem innocent of your own parents' death if you're not involved? They had also dressed her in a Mickey Mouse shirt. They had put colorful clips in her hair just to make her seem younger, therefore innocent. And this might have worked if the camera hadn't caught that exact moment. That's the scary thing. The wildest motives began being thrown out in court as to why she would have done this, saying Daniel actually said that Suzane was sexually assaulted by her father, and she denied this, so did Andreas. And it was also said that Manfrid and Mauricea were alcoholics that abused their children, and everybody denied this, saying there was no way. There was no alcohol found in their body. They didn't harm the kids at all. And it was also very telling because Daniel and Christian, throughout their entire trials, were crying. Every time it was talked about, every time they were basically talked to at all. However, even when hearing what exactly had been done to her parents, Suzane was completely dry-eyed. She had even been caught laughing several times. Daniel said Christian didn't have anything to do with it. He was trying to cover up for his brother. Or maybe Christian didn't. Daniel said that Christian didn't do anything, he did it all, and he only did it because Suzane was constantly talking about their deaths, that she was either going to cut their brakes or catch their house on fire to get rid of them because that's how much she wanted it, and finally he just said he would do it. Not that that makes it any better. Suzane continued to say that she was there that night while they were doing that, but she was scared, she was confused, and she didn't know how to stop them, yet she said all of this. She went through her trial with a very emotionless look in her eyes and a very cold personality. On July 22nd, Suzane and Daniel were sentenced to 40 years in prison and Christian to 39, and for 7 months Suzane was actually put in solitary confinement because they were worried what she would do. Now the prosecutors said that Suzane was the personification of an evil blonde. In 2014, Suzane would be in the media once again, and this was actually for marrying another inmate who was Sandra Gomez, and Suzane had to turn down parole to marry Sandra, and she did so she could be in this bigger cell where 8 other couples would get to stay. And I'm not sure if they're nicer or if it's just a place you can stay with your spouse, but you basically have to sign a document saying that you are in a committed relationship with this person while in jail, and you can stay in this married cell. Now, Sandra Gomez was serving a 27-year sentence in prison for helping her boyfriend with the kidnapping of a child and the killing of the child in 2006 when a ransom was not paid. Sandra and Suzane had met in a prison clothing factory and hit it off from there. However, this wasn't the first inmate that Suzane was in a relationship with. She had actually been with 32-year-old Eliza Matsunaga, who had killed and dismembered her own husband. Now, Suzane's manipulative ways did continue in prison. It was said that her prosecutor as well as the prison doctor were both very seduced by her, put under a spell, and they would do anything she wanted. She was also granted what is called a half-open program in Brazil, where they can go out on holidays into the real world, do whatever they want, and then go back. And she was granted this, and so she was out on holidays like Mother's Day, Father's Day, even though she had killed her own mother and father. This has since been revoked, and I'm not sure exactly why, but Suzane is no longer in this half-open program. She has also had some psychological tests to figure out why she would have done this, what made her who she is. And it was found that she has an egotistical personality with narcissistic traits. She also has a predisposition to violent behavior, and she has no guilt or remorse for her crimes. Now, just because she's out of the half-open program, she's still eligible for 5 days out of the year out of prison to do whatever. Now, she is no longer the evil blonde, but that isn't because she isn't evil. It's because she's no longer blonde. She's actually dyed her hair red in prison. In 2014, Daniel actually got married in jail as well, but it was to his cellmate's sister who was out of jail, who had come to visit him, and they had instantly fallen in love. His wife said it was a wonderful surprise to meet Daniel, but then she was fired from her job for marrying a murderer. And in 2017, Christian was actually released from prison, but he would be caught with ammunition and would try to bribe the officers to not go back to jail, and this would of course put him back in jail. But in 2018, Daniel was actually released for good after 15 years for murder. It's said that he's living a normal family life, but it's no longer known where his family members are. They can no longer be located. But whatever happened to Suzane's little brother, who had his whole family ripped away from him? Well, he went to live with his uncle and was also supported by his grandmother, and they really tried to give him the most normal life you could possibly get at this point. This wasn't easy though, considering Andreas's last name was so well known. Everybody knew who he was, who his sister was, and what she had done to their parents, and they would constantly not really talk to him about it, but he just knew they were judging him for it, and it was something he couldn't escape from even if he wanted to. Andreas at first didn't necessarily hate his sister though. He even wrote a letter to Suzane in a local newspaper saying, "Not only did I forgive my sister Sue, but I still love her. Now especially is the moment she needs love. In spite of the pain, I'm sure my parents have forgiven her. Just the other day I heard a phrase that struck me. Humanity must walk together in the search of the civilization of love." Now, he visited his sister in prison for a while, and as he got older, he actually went to college to earn a PhD in chemistry, and his life was going really well. He would earn half of the inheritance, and this is when he was told he needed to make a statement saying that he did not want to put his sister Suzane in his will, because they feared that if she were to be out on some of these outings she was allowed, she would kill Andreas for his portion of the inheritance. And he did so, saying that what Suzane did was disgusting, and you could tell his mindset about her had really changed over the years quite drastically, and it would change even more in 2011. He would then sue Suzane for her half of the inheritance, and he would win, getting all of that money. However, it was said that Suzane still had plenty to her name because her father Manfrid, of course before he knew what his daughter would do, had put some inheritance money away for her and some Swiss bank accounts that nobody else knew about. And he put Suzane's name on it, meaning that she's the one who gets it. Now, she was also kept in the will of her grandmother, who had millions of dollars, and this grandmother didn't believe she was guilty, so she kept her on there. In 2017, Andreas would be back in the news after dropping off the face of the earth for quite a few years. Nobody knew where he had gone, if he was okay, and that is when a police would be called in about a prowler in a house who had broken in, and this was nearby the von Richthoften home. Now, they found that this was actually Andreas, who hadn't been seen in years, and he was dirty and he was paranoid. His eyes were glazed over, and he really thought that somebody was out to get him. He also said he was only in the home under the orders of the emperor. Andreas had been found to spend the last few years on the streets, and he was now heavily into drugs and alcohol and was thought to have a mental illness. He was sent to a psychiatric facility after this to get help, and I'm not sure if he's since been released or not, but I think that this is the most heartbreaking part of the entire case, and it truly makes you realize that childhood trauma changes you completely. It can make your life go in a completely different direction, and it's hard to deal with it. I also think the fact that his first message about Suzane was the fact that she just needs more love. That's all she needs. That's what I'm going to give her. This can often be what people feel, that if they love hard enough, if they want somebody to heal, if they give them that love that they are missing, they will be a better person. And unfortunately, this is not the case. Not always, not most of the time. And Love doesn't cure evil. It doesn't stop a bad person from continuing to do bad things no matter how much you want it to. I mean, you cannot love a person out of being a monster no matter how hard you try. And I think that as Andreas got older, he started to realize this. And that is when he pulled away. And that is when he really saw his reality break even more. Because not only did he lose his parents, but he lost his sister too. Now, next I want to talk to you about something that I just recently learned. You guys know I like to put any sort of psychology in here that I can. And I learned this from the Evidence Locker podcast, which is a great podcast. I'll link it down below. They have a YouTube channel and it's wonderful. And I actually learned about the banality of evil. And this is from a book called Eichmann in Jerusalem. It's the theory that sometimes there isn't an underlying evil. Sometimes it's a thoughtlessness. Now, this theory says that most people don't choose whether they're going to be a good or a bad person before they decide to do a bad thing. An example in the book was Adolf Eichmann, who was on trial and he displayed zero guilt for what he had done, but he also didn't hate the people trying him. He simply said it was his job. That's what he did. But some say this is kind of a theory making the evil seem innocent, and I can kind of see that a little bit. I'm not sure where I stand on this exactly, other than I hate for this to be another excuse where a murderer could possibly go free, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. The whole reason this was brought up is because some people were comparing Suzane's actions to possibly being a banality of evil. But Suzane was very thought out about what she wanted to do, and it wasn't a spur of the moment thing. It wasn't something that she felt like she necessarily was being forced to do or just something that was going to happen. It was something that she had thought out for quite a while and planned, and she was also doing it for no one but herself. It was a very selfish act. However, you could say that Daniel's brother Christian was a banality of evil example because he did it for his brother, who was doing it for his girlfriend, just he was helping someone out. And I think that this could be kind of more of a theory of people who are under someone in power and feel that that is the only way, and they also don't feel any remorse. But then again, Christian felt remorse, and I think that a key here in this for the banality of evil is that they don't feel remorseful for what they've done. I haven't really researched all that much into it, but I thought that I would bring it to you if you guys want to research some more, because it was really intriguing and I'm not sure what I think about it. Now, this case was very widely talked about, mainly because it really showed that crime versus class did not always go the way that people thought it would. Many people thought Daniel and Christian were the main ones strictly because they were a lower class, and that Suzane couldn't have done it because she was wealthy. This changed everything in Brazil. I mean, Suzane had the best money and schooling and family and home that she could have ever bought, and yet she murdered her parents. It was one of the first times that people began to realize that money didn't automatically equal you being a good person, and lack thereof didn't equal a bad person. I mean, this should be common sense, but unfortunately it is not, and even in some cases we can be deceived by how people act, what people look like, or even their personality. As always, I hope you learned a little something from this video, and I would still like to know how a millionaire became a murderer too. If you'd like to watch more videos, you can. I'll link some down below, and if you check out my channel, I have tons on there. I'm so freaking grateful that you all have found me recently, and ones who have stuck with me forever. I cannot believe how many of you care about these victims and about how I tell these stories, and it truly means the world to me. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.